Management of change. In this lesson, we will showcase one of the possible ways to do the so-called management of change. But what do we consider as change? And why is this topic so important for quality? Let's see a simple example. Think of it this way. Your company works with conditions A, B, C, D. Condition A may be using a specific machinery in your production line. Condition B is the environment in which you operate. For example, could be the temperature. Condition C would be using a specific type of worker. Condition D would be using a specific raw material. In our example, on day 1, your company works with conditions A, B, C, D, and your production is completely fine. Days pass by. On day 2, production is still doing very well. Also on day 3, the product is still compliant. Also on day 4. And finally, on day 5, all the conditions are the same and all is good. Then on day 6, something changes. Condition D changes into condition E. And in our example, something bad happens. Production is not working as expected. The product is not compliant anymore. For example, instead of using a specific raw material from a trusted provider, you bought this raw material from another provider, and for some reason, the production process did not work as intended. So your company operated in a controlled environment for 5 days, but it's also true that your company wasn't able to do that for very long. As soon as a condition changed, the system malfunctioned. You can now wonder, does it mean that in an ISO 9001 certified company, things cannot ever change? Of course not. Change is normal and part of the natural functioning of every company. What matters is that change is always a controlled change. One last piece of theory. In this slide, you can see some examples of possible changes that can affect your company. The tool that we will give you will help you to manage these changes. This will ensure that your company will remain a controlled environment before, during, and after the change. As always, while transitioning from the theory to the practice, we introduce to you the documents in our template that will help you manage the process concretely. Yes, you guessed it. They are a procedure, management of change procedure, and a tool, management of change form. Let's start from the procedure. We may all agree by now that management of change is important and that it needs to be done through a specific process. This process is described in the management of change procedure that you can find inside our template zip. This procedure just explains step by step how to use our management of change form. So now, we can move to actually see how the form looks like. Let's make an example of how change management could work in a company. In this example, our company has several pieces of machinery. One of the engineers would like to have one of the machineries to be replaced with a different type of machinery. The reason of this is that the current machinery is not ideal for this process and is slowing down production. You can see in this slide that the engineer thinks of this change. Then the change is done. And then basically, the company hopes for the best. This is based on assumptions that this change is needed, is beneficial, and the positives will outcome the negatives. As you can probably guess, this comes with some risks. Uncalculated risks. After showing you a bad example of management of change, we will show you a good example. And in this good example, we will use our management of change form. Our good example starts exactly like the previous one. The engineer thinks of a possible change in production. The second step, however, is very different. Instead of immediately doing the change, the engineer fills the first steps of the management of change form. In these steps, he describes the change that he or she wants to be done. Here, you see a screenshot of this step. in the template. The engineer has to describe here what exactly the change would be and provide some extra information. The following step is that the other managers read his or her proposal and make evaluations of the risks and opportunities of this possible change. These evaluations need to be written in the form. Again, here are the screenshots of how these steps are covered in the form. First, the change is assigned to a change owner. This person will coordinate this process until the final decision. This person does not need to be an expert on all these topics. And then, as anticipated, here are all the questions that the other managers need to answer in the form. This is just the first set of questions. And here is the second set of questions. Please note how these questions cover a very big variety of topics: financial, health and safety, human resources, compliance, and so on. Ideally, these questions would trigger in the managers the right evaluations. But don't forget that these are just examples of possible questions. You are free to add in your management of change template all the questions you want that will make sense specifically for your company and the specific risks and opportunities that it is exposed to. Now, in case some managers found that indeed there are some risks related to this change, in this step, actions are planned to reduce these risks to an acceptable level, or eliminate them. In our template, this is done by a simple action planner. Please note that planning an activity is not enough. You also need to check that the activity is actually done. This is why we also have a step that is an action effectiveness check. We are now getting close to the end. In this step, high management makes the final decision to implement the change or not. In our template, this is the final step. The CEO needs to compile this part and clearly state yes or no, and maybe even give some additional explanation if needed. And now, the real final part. The change is actually done. This concludes our lesson about management of change. As always, we encourage you to customize both the procedure and the form heavily in order to make it compliant to your specific situation. Be aware that this is a very important topic and that it is checked quite often during external audits. So be sure to actually use this tool and be able to provide some concrete examples of how your company manages changes systematically. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.